Today I'm going to be explaining my thought process when visiting a carp lake for the first time, hopefully helping you approach a new water and catch more carp. First of all, you're going to want to choose the right water for you. And what I mean by that is, if you're a beginner and you're just getting into your carp fishing, maybe don't go and choose a massive low stock gravel pit. Probably won't be the best place to hone your skills and get some bites. I would be looking for somewhere like a day ticket fishery, a club water, which has got a decent stock of carp. If you happen to be a more experienced angler, maybe you've done a few seasons and you've caught plenty of fish whilst fishing smaller lakes with higher stock of fish, and you want to catch some bigger ones maybe, then take a look at maybe a syndicate venue or join a local club which might have somewhere with a slightly lower stock but, some better fish on offer. Before fishing anywhere, I definitely advise talking to the fishery manager, maybe the bailiff, checking the online catch report if there is one, just to work out whether or not this is the right venue for you. The last thing, that you want to do is push yourself too far. If you're a beginner and you start on somewhere that's rock hard and you do 3 or 4 months fishing without a bite, that may well dent your enthusiasm for the hobby. So approach the owner or the bailiff or whatever and get an idea of whether or not the venue is suitable for you. Having a good session on a new venue actually starts before you even get to the water. I like to make sure that I'm reasonably well prepared before I go somewhere for the first time. If I'm fishing somewhere I've been a lot of times, I can just turn up and be like, oh yeah, I know that they like to feed on the surface in that bay, or I know that I can get a bite on a zig rig in that swim. So you only really need to bring your floater gear and your zig gear. But if you're going somewhere for the first time, you have no idea how those fish are going to behave. You have no idea what's going to work. I would definitely advise the night before you go, or whenever you've got some time, tidy your tackle box. Make sure you've got all the components you need to tie the rigs that you like using. Make sure you've got a selection of lead sizes, for example, just in case you turn up and you have to use a big lead and cast a long way to get to where the fish are. Get yourself prepared before your session, and that will definitely help you with being able to adjust your tactics on the day. Just be prepared and know where your tackle is. The last thing that you want to do is get to the water, find fish feeding in the margins, and then you spend the next 30 minutes rummaging through all your gear trying to find where your leads or hooks are or something. The other thing to keep in mind is maybe don't bring too much gear. It can be tempting when you're going somewhere for the first time, you're very excited, to bring absolutely every item of kit you own. And if you have too much gear with you, you're less likely to move swims on the day because it would just feel like too much hassle to pack everything up again. So pack it, relatively light if you can to ensure you can move swims and get on the fish should they start showing at the other end of the lake, for example. So let's just pretend you've got your ticket or your permit now and you're at the water's edge. Now you need to look for the fish. The best time to see fish showing is first light and probably an hour or two after that. That seems to be the time where most fish stick their heads out or go for a little jump. And that morning feeding time as well, they'll be sending up bubbles and stuff. So if you can be on the water at first light, you're a lot more likely to see signs of carp. I would advise walking as much as possible and keeping your eyes glued on the water. You could, of course, turn up and set up in the first swim that you find, chuck a rod out and catch one. But you could also do that, and then as the day wears on, you realise all the fish are at the other end of the lake and you wasted a whole lot of time. So however much time you spend looking for them early in the morning, at the beginning of your session, it really will pay off. There's obviously a chance you'll get lucky and just pick a swim and there just happens to be fish there. But the number of times we've been out on a session, we've got there, we've done 2 laps of the lake maybe, it's a lot of walking, but then eventually we've found a load of fish in a little bay or something. They've been crashing out at long range and we've been able to get on them and get bites very quickly. That time spent looking for them is almost always worthwhile. If you are allowed to use a boat on the venue that you're at, there's not really a lot of waters in the UK that permit boats, but if you are, definitely take that opportunity. grab your life jacket, get on that boat and head out and try and find them. The thing that a boat enables you to do is look down into the water, and that means you can sort of go around a lake and look for stirred up water. So if the majority of the lake is quite clear and you drift the boat over and it looks a little bit more murky, a little bit more muddy, that is most probably feeding carp. A boat can definitely give you an advantage over, just being on the shore looking out. So consider that if that is an option on the water you're fishing. If despite all of your looking and searching for carp, you have not been able to find anything, no fish are bubbling, jumping, or stirring up any water, then the next best thing is to talk to the venue regulars, maybe local anglers, the bailiff, the owner. They will often have information that can be quite valuable. Stuff such as, oh yeah, the fish, seem to hold up in those snags in the winter. Or, on a sunny day, you'll often find them out in the middle, in the shallow plateau or something. Local anglers can definitely give you information that is very, very helpful. That said, some anglers won't want to give away their secrets, and they may tell you to get lost. But there are, really genuine, lovely anglers out there too who just want to see other people catch and help out. So it's definitely worth asking, but just don't take it to heart if someone doesn't want to give away any location-based secrets. Once you decide on a certain spot that you're going to fish, you kind of have two options. One option is you set your rod up with just a lead on the end and you start to make casts around the swim to try and find a spot to fish. You might be looking for a clay spot, you might be looking for some gravel maybe where you can present a rig, you might just be looking for gaps in between the weed. So that's one option. You get there, you put a lead on, you start casting around trying to find a spot. The other option is that you arrive and just cast a rig out straight away. The times where I would put maybe a chod rig on or a solid bag and just cast it straight out is when I've arrived in the swim and there's fish bubbling, or there's fish crashing out on a certain area, or I can see them drifting along in the margins. In those sort of circumstances, you don't want to chuck a lead out and start trying to find a spot and splashing around with it, because you'll just scare those fish away and you could lose that opportunity to catch them. Instead, if you can see the fish and you think they're probably feeding, you want to get a rig in there, then a chod rig, a solid bag, something like that just presents very easily. You don't need to check what the bottom's like. You can just cast a chod rig or a solid bag straight out. Well, I would definitely do that. If you can see fish feeding, you want to catch them, you want to get a bait in as quick as possible with as least disturbance as possible. Even a single hook bait, just take your rig, pop up, put it out there where those fish are jumping or bubbling, and you could get a really quick bite. That said, if you arrive in the swim and there's no bubbling, there's no fish crashing, you can't see fish in the margins or on the surface, and you don't really know where to start, that's when I'd say take a rod with some braid on the reel, just loop on a bare lead, nothing else. A couple of ounce lead is fine, maybe a 3 ounce lead if you need to cast a bit further, and just start methodically casting it around your swim and feeling it down to the bottom. The aim is to feel that drop, try and locate an area where you can present a rig nicely, and then maybe put a little bit of bait on that spot and get your rig out. But like I say, you got those two options, and if you arrive and there's fish already in the swim and they look like they're feeding, definitely just get a bait in the water, because you could get a very quick bite. So on the topic of finding a spot or working out what sort of lake bed you have in front of you, we like to use just a bare lead on the end of the braid. The reason we use braid is because there isn't any stretch in it. What that means is when you cast out and feel it down to the bottom, you feel the lead hit the bottom and it resonates straight away with the rod tip, rather than there being stretch and you not really detecting or being able to feel it so easily. The other thing is, once the lead's hit the bottom and you put the rod to one side and start to drag the rod tip back, with braid you can feel what it's dragging through, and with monofilament, because it's stretchy, you just kind of it just bounces back and stretches, and you don't really feel what's on the bottom so easily, especially at long range. If you have cast your lead out into the lake and you tried to feel it down to the bottom and you couldn't, it either means it's very shallow or it means it's very silty or very weedy. If you felt the lead down to the bottom and it was falling and then the rod tip sprung back very quickly, falling, donk, the rod tip springs back, that's most likely hard clay or gravel on the bottom of the lake, something firm. A firm lake bed is quite good. That means you can fish a rig over the top of it and not be concerned about the lead sinking into the silt and disappearing and pulling your rig into it, or weeds masking your hook point. A lot of the time, carp anglers, when they're feeling the lead down, they're feeling for what you'll hear a lot of people say, the donk. It's a strange word, but it does kind of describe what it feels like when your lead cracks down on something nice and firm. The other thing about a firm lake bed, it probably means fish have fed there and kept that lake bed clear. On gravel pits, obviously a lot of the lake bed will be hard and gravelly, but if you're fishing somewhere that's quite silty and you don't get a drop most of the time, and then you put a cast out and you do get a drop and it hits the bottom hard, it's most probable that you've landed it in an area where the fish have cleaned the silt away because they've been feeding. That is a spot that you mustn't ignore. So let's say you've arrived at your swim and you've led it around for a little bit, you've found some spots that you're happy with. Once you know what's in front of you, you can better choose a rig that will present in that scenario. So if the lake bed is quite soft and silty, you feel the lead down, you kind of feel it hit the bottom, but it's quite gentle. You drag it back and it just comes back very smoothly. That probably means you're in silt. Depending on the depth of that silt, you'll want to make your rig incrementally longer. The reason you want to make that rig longer is because the lead will plunge into the silt a little bit, and you don't really want to pull your rig down into the silt with it. However, if you've cast your lead out and it's cracked down on the bottom and you've really felt that resonate through the rod tip, the lake bed is probably quite firm. With a firm lake bed, you can get away with using a much shorter hook length. A shorter rig means the fish, as it picks up the bait, will feel the weight of the lead sooner, which often helps with the hooking capabilities of the rig. The rig does its job better if it's a little bit shorter. The fish will pick up the bait, go to turn, bam, the lead pulls it in straight away. And we personally like to use relatively short rigs of about 6 inches or less if we're fishing on a very firm, hard lake bed, like clay or gravel, for example. If, when you're leading around, you've dragged back a small amount of stringy weed on the lead, or you've felt the lead down and you're pretty certain when you drag it back it's getting clogged a little bit, not a lot, just getting stuck a little bit, and then it pulls free a bit, there's probably a little bit of low-lying weed out in your swim. If your swim is quite weedy and where you choose to put your rig, there is definitely some low-lying weed near the bottom, then a pop-up rig is going to be very, very helpful. The advantages of a pop-up rig like a chod rig or a stiff hinge or Ronnie rig or anything like that is that the buoyant bait will settle down on top of the weeds slightly better than a sinking bait. If you imagine a sinking boilie on a hair rig, goes into some weeds and just sinks down and gets lost in it, the hook point is very likely to get stuck in a lot of those weeds. But if you're using a pop-up rig like a chod rig, then it's going to sink slowly and just sit on top of it because you've got that buoyant bait holding it up above the weeds. In summary, if you have found whilst leading around that the lake bed is quite clear, you don't need to worry too much about what rig you use over that. Pretty much anything is going to present fine. If you found that the silt is a little bit soft, then you might want to just make your rig a little bit longer or use a pop-up. And if you're fishing in weeds, then a chod rig is probably going to be your best bet with a nice buoyant pop-up. However, if you aren't fishing in any of those things because you've just looked out into the water and there's carp cruising around just underneath the surface, then scrap all those lead setups and rigs that are designed to fish on the deck, and instead think about your bread, your dog biscuits, and consider surface fishing. The next topic of this video is bait. If you've just arrived in your swim and there's fish feeding in front of you, they might be pluming up silt or you can just see them with their heads down, then you probably just want to get a single hook bait in and not worry too much about throwing bait around it. If they're already feeding, you might as well just get a bait in front of them and it's very likely that they'll come across it. However, there are times where you need to introduce some bait to try and make the fish go down and start feeding. For example, if you're in a swim and the fish are kind of cruising around a bit, they're showing a bit of interest, but they're not actively feeding on the bottom. A few handfuls of bait on the bottom and then a rig in the middle of it gives those carp a reason to go down and start feeding. Like I say, if they're feeding already, just flick a single hook bait in front of them. But if they are not really showing much interest in feeding, then you probably will need to put some bait in to tempt them into doing so. Some of the baits that we use the most and rely on to catch us fish from pretty much anywhere we go are things like corn, pepperami, boilies, pop-ups. And when it comes to winter, something like maggots or worms can be really good too. One thing I will say about bait is that you can put it in, but you can't take it back out. What I mean by that is it's very tempting to arrive at the swim and find a spot and just spod loads of bait out, put a couple of kilos on it or whatever. But actually, in a lot of cases, baiting too heavily too early on in a session can reduce your chances of catching, because the fish have got more bait to eat before they find your hook bait in amongst it. On a recent session in France, we actually turned up and fished a lake that most people bait very heavily at, and we just fished small scatterings of bait and caught plenty. What happens when you build a swim over time is you might catch a fish off of it, but then to tempt them back into feeding, you might want to put in a little bit more, and then a little bit more after the next bite. But don't just think that you need to bait really heavily to catch carp, because you really don't. You can often catch them off of just a handful or two of bait. On larger waters with big, high stocks, then if you want to stop the fish in your swim, yeah, by all means, you're probably going to need quite a lot of bait. But especially on the smaller places that are maybe a bit more pressured, more bait can sometimes mean less bites. So start off gentle, little bit of bait, and then build up should you need it. Earlier on in this video, I mentioned not bringing too much kit so that you can move swims more easily without having to lug a load of kit around. That becomes very important when you've been in a swim for an hour or two and you start seeing fish showing elsewhere. Obviously, in carp fishing, you do have to be patient at times. Sometimes it is a waiting game and you do just have to sit on your hands and just wait for those fish to turn up and start feeding. But if you're on limited time, maybe you've just got a day session on your hands, an hour in the right place is worth the rest of the day in the wrong place. If you're on a relatively high stock water and you're not getting bites, it could just be because they're somewhere else. Definitely keep your eyes on the water and definitely consider moving if they are showing elsewhere. So let's just say you're on your first session at a new water, you've approached it well and you've managed to catch one. It's really helpful if you can remember that exact spot you caught that fish from and be able to fish it again in the future. Now I'm going to explain to you how you can make a note of that spot and get back to it on your next trip. First of all, you want to cast to the spot, feel that it hits the right area and you know that's definitely where you had the bite from, and put the line in your line clip. Remember what the far bank marker is. So if you line up between you and your spot, what is there distinctively on the far side? Pick something that obviously won't move, not a train or a swan, but at the top of a tree is perfect. The top of a tree, or I don't know, electricity pylon or something. Anyway, make a note of what you were aiming at on the far bank in your phone. Then take your rod and reel it in. Remember, you've got your line in the clip. Take your distance sticks, set them 12 foot apart, or the length of your rod, but just make sure that the distance between them is measurable and always the same. Lay your lead down at one end and then start to count as you wrap the line around those sticks. This is what carp anglers refer to as wraps. You'll go round it, let's say 15 times, and then you get to there and then it hits the clip. You run out of line, you've counted that many times and then it's gotten to the clip. What you need to remember is the number of times you wrapped it round, and then write that down in your phone or in a notepad or something next to where you wrote down your far bank marker. So in ours, we'll have left hand tree 14 wraps, or we'll have electricity pylon 21 and a half wraps. What that means is on our next session, we can turn up at that swim, stick our distance sticks in, remember where the direction we need to cast, but also be able to put the lead down next to the sticks, wrap round, the same number of times that we've got written down, then put the line in the clip, close the bail arm, reel all that line off, and then when we cast it out into the lake, it will whiz out, hit the clip and land at that same distance at the same spot as it did on a previous session. Being able to turn up for your second or third session, let's say, and just whiz a rod straight back to the exact spot that you caught them that you caught fish from before without having to lead around to try and find it, that is a real edge, and that will definitely help you with your fishing. One thing that we encountered whilst using distance sticks was crack-offs and wind knots. Basically, we'd go to make a cast, too much line would come off the spool and the line would either snap or get tangled. The way we combated that was to make a small cast into the margins, reel it back onto the spool, and then make the big cast. For whatever reason, reeling that line back onto the spool after making a little cast just beds the line down a little bit better and a bit more neater, and then when you go to make the proper cast, it flies off just fine. So just keep that in mind. If you're using the distance sticks and the line seems to be springing off the spool too much and becoming tangled or cracking off, then yeah, consider a smaller cast, 15 yards down the margin or 10 yards or something. Reel it back on before you make your proper cast, and that should avoid any problems. If you end your session on a blank, then don't be too disheartened. Carp fishing is a bit of a puzzle, and all the time you're at the water, you're putting those pieces of the puzzle together, you're figuring out the water, and you'll crack it in time. One session you might stumble across a bit of a game changer, maybe a certain spot next to an island that just seems to hold the fish and you start getting bites from, or you might change bait and find that that's working really well for you on a certain venue. Definitely don't give up after your first or second session. You may have just not tried the right spot, you may have just not found the bait that they seem to respond well to. And also, carp fishing, and I hate to say it because we make tutorials about it, but carp fishing does have a lot of luck involved, and the best angler on the best lake in the best swim may well blank. And that's just, got a lot to do with luck. Sometimes you just need to try a few times, keep going back until you catch them. Fishing a new water can be tricky as you're effectively starting from new, but it can also be very rewarding when you catch something special. So now you've learned how to approach a new water, we'd definitely advise checking out this playlist, which is full of our favourite rigs, baits, tactics and approaches to catch you guys more carp. Hope you enjoy. See ya.